Cattle Nutrition 101. So there's going to be a lot of stuff we're going to go over very briefly. Nutrition is a very dense topic, but we're just going to scratch the surface tonight. So with cattle nutrition, like I just said, it's a very dense topic, and sometimes it can seem very overwhelming to think about and decide, where to start when you want to tackle something related to nutrition. So we're going to go through some of these to kind of make it less of a daunting topic for you. But first, I want to review some of the basic concepts for cattle nutrition, and we'll start, of course, with the cattle digestive system. As most of you probably know, the cow has 4 compartments to her stomach. There's the rumen, which is the largest compartment, and is the site of microbial fermentation. There's a reticulum, which is the compartment that's involved with cud chewing. And then there's the abomasum, the omasum, which is required for water absorption. And then finally, the abomasum, which is required for chemical digestion of nutrients. And this abomasum is very similar to the stomach that is in our monogastric species like humans and pigs and things like that. Now, the rumen is the key to our cattle digestive system because it is the site of that microbial fermentation that allows our cows to digest fibrous plant materials that other animals cannot digest. The ruminant stomach the animal is not born with a fully functioning rumen. It does take some time to develop over time. When the calf is born, she has a stomach that is largely dominated by this abomasum, which is the very similar to the monogastric stomach, and the rumen makes up a very small portion of the animal's stomach. But as it grows and matures, the rumen eventually takes over to be the largest compartment of the stomach, which makes sense because they are going to be consuming fibrous plant materials when they're more mature, and that allows them to utilize those plant materials efficiently. So that just is something to consider when we're thinking about feeding young animals versus more mature animals and the types of feeds that will feed them because of their stomach physiology. So I'm going to go through some of the types of feeds that we often feed to our cattle. There's hay, pasture, and silage, and that makes up the forages that we oftentimes feed. Hay is stored dry, so it's less than 20% moisture. Some common examples include orchard grass, fescue, alfalfa, timothy, mixed grass, and mixed legume hay. We have pasture grasses, which are grasses that are usually grazed, and we have perennial versus annual pastures, cool season versus warm season pastures, and grasses versus legumes. So there's a lot of things, a lot of different species we can lump into our pastures depending on our objectives and our environment and what type of management system we want. We also have silage, which is a wet forage. It's stored at about 60 to 70% moisture, and it is preserved in an anaerobic or oxygen-free environment. So either it will be stored as baleage or in a bunker silo or in a silo, upright silo itself. And examples of that include corn silage, alfalfa silage, grass silage, baleage, and things like that. So in terms of concentrates, I'd like to group them into 3 main categories: energy sources, protein sources, or vitamins and minerals. For our energy sources, they can be cereal grains or they can be byproduct feeds. Cattle are pretty unique in that they can utilize a lot of byproduct feeds that cannot be used by other animals and otherwise would be thrown away by some industries. So it's really a unique feature of cattle, raising cattle, is to be able to use those byproduct feeds. But in terms of cereal grains for energy, we often see corn, barley, and wheat. There's others, but those are the most common ones. Byproduct feeds include hominy, wheat middlings, beet pulp, and things like that. Some common protein sources, the most common one you'll come across is of plant origin, it's soybean meal, but there's also several byproduct feeds that serve as protein sources as well, including canola meal, distillers grains, brewers grains, and corn gluten meal. And then we have vitamins and minerals, which most folks will purchase as a complete mix, or they'll order a specified mix from the mill. Minerals of interest, when we talk about mineral nutrition, are typically calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, and selenium. Obviously, there are many others, but those are the big ones that oftentimes come up. So some common definitions in the context of nutrition. The first one that's really important to understand is something called dry matter. It's the portion of feeds that does not contain water. So diets are oftentimes formulated on a dry matter basis to remove the effect that water content has on feed nutrient density. And that's particularly important when we're talking about diets that contain those wet forages like corn silage and baleage and things like that, because water obviously dilutes the nutrient content of a feed. The other two major definitions that I want to go over are protein and energy. So protein is required for tissue growth and many bodily functions. I'm not going to go through them, but some of the common protein terms that you might see is crude protein or CP, or metabolizable protein or MP. Energy is required to fuel metabolic processes. So it's required for growing, required for the immune system functioning and everything under the sun. So some common energy terms that you'll see are net energy or NE, metabolizable energy or ME, as well as total digestible nutrients or TDN. So don't get bogged down in terms of what the difference is among all of these different terms, because there are differences, but we're not going to go into that today. I just want you to have an idea that these are the different terms that you might see. So going into some more of our definitions, I like to talk about carbohydrates a little bit because that's where most of the energy is in the diet is going to come from. And carbohydrates have several different fractions, and you might see some of those terms pop up in your nutrition journey. Carbohydrates can be broken down very basically into structural or non-structural carbohydrates. So structural carbohydrates, I always like to think fiber. Non-structural carbohydrates, I always like to think sugar. So structural carbohydrates are made up of cellulose, hemicellulose, lignin, and pectin. And then our non-structural carbohydrates are made up of sugar and starches. Our cellulose and hemicellulose are digestible thanks to microbial fermentation, but they're not as digestible as our pectins, sugars, and starches. And then lignin is the indigestible component of the carbohydrate fraction of the plant. So neutral detergent fiber, or NDF, is a term that you might see on your forage analysis or things like that. That is basically these three components: cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. And that term reflects what we call gut fill, or the filling effect of a feed or of the diet. Obviously, the more NDF or the more fiber it is in the diet, the longer time it'll spend in the animal's stomach, and it'll take longer to break down, and it will fill her up, and she won't be able to eat as much. TDN, I mentioned that earlier, but that's another concept that reflects the energy available after digestion. It's basically a term that's calculated, but it includes carbohydrates, but it also includes proteins and things like that. So it's not just carbohydrates, but I put it on here again just to reiterate that it is kind of an energy term. So now that we've reviewed some of the basics, we'll get going with some of, about how we can actually use this information to, feed our cows and assess, what they're eating and whether or not it's enough. So the goal of a nutrition program, I always like to remind people, is generally going to be to utilize feeds to provide a cost-effective and balanced diet. Now, when I say cost-effective, I mean you're getting the most bang for your buck. And when I say balanced diet, I mean that it's going to meet the nutrient requirements to ensure the desired level of production that you want from your animals. And it's always important to begin with the end in mind and feed with an intention. So to build a balanced diet, I have a series of steps that we're going to go through here. But the very first step is going to be something that seems very basic, but it's going to be defining the animal. And that's one of the that's the very first step. It's a very key step. So if you mess this part up, you could have problems later on, or you might not see the performance of your animals that you want. So what makes the diet balanced? Well, obviously we want to balance what the animal consumes with what the animal actually requires. And what the animal requires is based on several factors related to the animal, as well as the environment. And what the animal consumes is related to factors mainly associated with the feed, but also some factors associated with the animal as well. So in order to provide a balanced diet, we need to first make sure we know what the animal requires, and that's where we're going to start. So nutrient requirements are influenced by several different factors. The two main categories are maintenance and production. Our maintenance factors are body size, environment, as well as activity. And then our production requirements are going to be associated with growth, milk production, as well as reproduction. So we're going to go through very briefly some of how these different factors influence nutrient requirements for maintenance. So maintenance requirements are the level of nutrition required to maintain basic functions without weight loss or gain in the animal. These requirements must be met before additional nutrients can be used to support production. So if you're not meeting the maintenance requirements of your animals, they're not going to perform to the level that you want them to, and they might even lose weight. So body size is that first factor that I mentioned that will influence maintenance requirements. So as animals get larger, they require more nutrients to maintain themselves. So both of these figures, this one on the left is showing energy requirements in relation to body weight, animal size. And then this one on the right is showing protein requirement in relation to body weight. So you can see that both of those increase as the animal gets larger. Environment is a big one that will influence our maintenance requirements. The thermal neutral zone for cattle is between 32 and 77 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on, if they're acclimated to different environments and their coat, things like that. But that's generally the range that we use. Temperature range does vary a little bit more for young calves. It's a little bit higher. But the thermal neutral zone is basically the range at which cattle do not have to expend a substantial amount of energy to maintain their body temperature. So temperatures below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, the animals are going to be cold stressed, so they're going to shiver and they're going to expend energy to do that. And then temperatures that are above 77, they're going to be heat stressed and they're going to be panting and to dissipate the extra heat. And they're going to use energy for that. The range, obviously, like I mentioned earlier, varies depending on coat condition, acclimation level, as well as age and production. And obviously moisture, mud, and humidity play a big role. Humidity is a big one for the summertime, but moisture and mud obviously are things that we think about in the wintertime. Activity level also affects animals' maintenance energy requirements or nutrient requirements. Increased activity level will increase nutrient requirements. So activity level associated with grazing, breeding, going to water or socializing if they're, integrated into a new group or something like that. Those can all affect the animal's energy and nutrient requirements. So this graph here on the right is just showing how energy requirements for maintenance changes depending on forage availability in the pasture. So low availability versus high availability, as well as topography. So you can see that even at a level surface, if there's more forage available, the animals are going to require less energy for maintenance because they're not going to have to, walk a great distance to get all of their nutrients per day. And that difference becomes exacerbated when you get to more rough terrain like hilly pastures and things like that. They're going to have to work really hard to get all of their forage in a day if the forage is more sparse. So now we're going to go through quickly some of the how different performance levels affect the requirements for production. So growth is defined as adding body mass. So requirements for growth are going to depend on the type of growth, frame versus muscle versus fattening. Reproduction is the nutrients required for breeding and or gestation. So in breeding season, obviously we want to make sure we're ensuring appropriate body condition of our males and females, and in order to maximize fertility. And then during gestation, we want to make sure we're ensuring appropriate nutrition to support fetal growth and development, and as well as appropriate body condition. Lactation is obviously nutrient requirements for producing milk to nourish the calf. And that generally has a pretty high nutrient demand, especially during early lactation. But that demand generally tapers off as the cow gets closer to weaning the calf. So now we've gone through, all the factors that go into defining the animal. The next step is to list the available feeds. So when we're thinking about choosing feeds, we first want to think about economics and practicality and what you're capable of feeding on your farm, and what your goals are. Are you wanting to confine your animals and just feed them hay or grain or something like that? Or do you want to make them rely on forage only, or do you want to supplement grain? So they're all things that you need to consider when choosing different feeds. And the other thing is, we just mentioned, animal description is important, but we also need to have an idea of what type of animal you're feeding when you're choosing feeds, because they're going to require different things. An early lactation cow is going to need a more energy dense feed than a dry pregnant cow or something to that effect. So it's always a good idea when choosing feeds and trying to allocate them to different groups of animals to have a feed analysis completed, because it can help you, figure out which will be the most appropriate for each group. It's always a good idea to get a feed analysis whenever there's a new cutting or a new harvest date for a feed, a new purchase lot, or poor animal performance. If you're feeding byproduct feeds, generally every time you get a new load, we recommend doing a feed analysis, because byproduct feeds can be very highly variable from load to load. I always like to point out that looks can be really deceiving, so you shouldn't just rely on physical appearance to determine whether or not a feed is good quality or not. So there are a couple of different steps in order to obtain a feed analysis. The first is to collect a sample. If it's pasture, we recommend clipping, some clippings from 20 or more random areas throughout each pasture or paddock before you graze it, not afterwards, but right before you're about to graze it. And when you're clipping your pasture, you want to make sure you're cutting it at a height that will mimic grazing height. And you want to avoid sampling overly mature grasses, seed heads, or weeds, or anything that animals are not going to eat, because you want a sample that's going to be reflective of what the animal is actually going to eat. And if you're doing baled hay or silage, it's always a good idea to use a hay core probe and obtain multiple core samples throughout that bale or throughout that silage pile, if possible. The next step is to ship the sample to the forage lab as soon as you can after collection. If you can't send it right away, stick it in the fridge for a day or two. And if you can't send it within a day or two, stick it in the freezer. We want to make sure that it's not sitting out in a hot car or anything like that, because that does alter the results of the forage analysis. We have a website at the link listed here that has a list of certified forage labs around our area. And then, of course, the last step is to receive the lab results and interpret them. And lab results generally come within a day, within a week. A lot of times it's within a day or two. It's pretty quick. So what do we look for on the feed analysis report? In terms of energy, I mentioned several of these terms already, but the two that I like to look at are TDN as well as net energy, or NE. Protein, those are the two terms I mentioned before, but in terms of simplicity, I like to look at crude protein really quick. And then minerals, I mentioned earlier calcium and phosphorus, but if you're concerned about selenium or magnesium or potassium, those are often listed on your report as well. So this is an example of a forage analysis report that you might see. This is from a Timothy Hay. It's actually pretty low quality, and I'll explain that here in just a minute. But the first pieces of information that I'm going to point out to you is neutral detergent fiber, or NDF. I mentioned that earlier, as well as lignin. So if you remember, lignin is that indigestible portion of the fiber, whereas NDF is made up of cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. So for legumes, we generally say that an NDF level of less than 40% is good quality, whereas greater than 50% is poorer quality. For grasses, we generally say that NDF less than 50% is good quality, whereas if it's greater than 60%, it's going to be poorer quality. And those are just, obviously you can't just look at the NDF and say that this is a good quality forage or not. There are other things to look at. Those are some just ballpark figures to get you going. TDN is another one I mentioned that I'd like to look at. TDN less than 55% is generally considered low energy density, where if it's greater than 70%, it's considered high energy density. The other two ones we have down here are sugars, as well as non-structural carbohydrates. And then we also have relative feed value, or RFV. So that's an indicator of forage quality. Anything less than 100 is generally considered to be lower quality, depending on the type of animal you're feeding. So after we've gone through listing our available feeds, the next step is to formulate a diet. So I'm going to go through briefly how we could accomplish that. There are several methods to it, but I'm going to show you a few because it can get pretty complicated if you go into it really in a lot of detail. So some basic diet formulation points. The first thing you want to make sure you have is the basic information gathered. So you want to have an idea of the expected feed intake of your animals. So We generally will say about 2% of body weight on a dry matter basis. We want to make sure we have our animal description. So those would include things like age, body weight, sex, as well as production level. And we also want to have an idea of what the feeds available to us are, as well as their nutrient profile. So basically everything that I've explained to this point, we want to make sure we have all together in order to move forward. There is a document called the Beef Cattle NRC, and the link to it is listed here, but that basically will list all of the nutrients that the animals require based on different types and levels of production. It's a pretty big document. It has lots of different tables in it, but that's where the numbers for the following slides are going to come from. And that basically will show you how much energy and protein the animals will need in order to meet the production level that you want. So there are a couple different formulation options. So the simplest is to, and obviously it doesn't really cost you anything, is to use an Excel spreadsheet or pen and paper. And that's pretty simple, especially if you're only feeding 1 or 2 different feeds, which is oftentimes the case for a lot of our producers. And in that case, I would recommend using this NRC document to figure out the requirements for energy and protein that your cattle need. If you want to get a little more sophisticated, you can also use a computer program. I know the Beef Cattle NRC does have a free program out there. It's a little bit more complex than doing it pen and paper, but it does exist. And then, of course, you can always go to a nutrition consultant for more complicated type nutrition balancing formulations. So in this example, I just want to kind of walk you through kind of how I would evaluate what I'm feeding a group of heifers. So in this example, we're using growing replacement heifers that are 500 pounds in their current weight. And then we have all this other information listed here. So things like mature weight, that's important to know because we want to know how big they need to be at breeding. So we need to know how big they need to be at breeding. We do the math, we figure out that they need to gain 280 pounds in order to be at our target breeding weight. So let's say the date of our current weight. So this was, let's say it was, September 15th. And we wanted them to be at breeding weight by May 1st of the following year. So that's 228 days. So that means that we have to gain this 280 pounds within this 228 days. And that gets us to an average daily gain target of about 1.2 pounds per day. And then we, of course, will go using our 2% of body weight estimate for estimated feed intake. We get about 10 pounds estimated feed intake per day per animal. So what do we do with this information? So if we go into our Beef Cattle NRC, we can see that the table will show us the average daily gain of animals that are replacement heifers that are 500 pounds. And at these different levels, it will give you an idea of what percentage the diet needs to be of TDN as well as crude protein, so energy and protein. And then we'll find our number here at 1.2 pounds average daily gain per day. And I always like to point out that animals require amounts of nutrients or quantities of nutrients and not percentages. So I always like to look at the amount of protein and energy that's being provided as well. So we can see the ideal diet for these animals would be about 58% TDN, 12.2% crude protein, and that equates to about 5.9-ish pounds of TDN per day and 1.2 pounds of crude protein per day. And you'll see why I like to go to pounds here in just a minute. So what are you going to feed? So we'll go through 3 different scenarios. So the first scenario would be pasture only. Let's say you have plenty of pasture available. It's a fescue pasture. You tested it. It's 15% crude protein and 63% TDN. That is great. So these are our targets from the previous slide, our target protein and TDN percentage of the diet, as well as the amount of protein and TDN that we hope to feed our animals. And we can see that our crude protein exceeds what the minimum we would need for our heifers, as well as our TDN exceeds that percentage as well. So if there are sufficient quantities of pasture available, this will do fine as the sole source of feed from a protein and energy standpoint. Obviously, you'd want to supplement with minerals too. But in terms of protein and energy, this would be just fine. But a lot of us run into this problem where we don't have enough pastures or enough pasture grass available for all the heifers. So what do? So in this next scenario, we'll look at feeding supplemental hay. In this example, we'll say that about half of the expected feed intake, so 5 pounds, will come from that fescue pasture. And about 5 pounds is going to come from hay. And we want to know what the minimum protein and TDN content of the hay we need to have in order to still meet our 1.2 pounds of gain per day target. So first we need to figure out how much protein and energy that pasture is supplying. So we'll do that by quick math. So we'll do it's 15% crude protein multiplied by 5 pounds. We get about 3/4 of a pound of protein being supplied by the pasture. We do the same thing with our TDN. It's 63% TDN multiplied by 5 pounds. We get about 3 pounds of TDN being supplied by the pasture. So this is where I like to pull in the target amount of protein and TDN that we need so that we can figure out how much we need in the hay. So we take our crude protein, we need 1.2 pounds per day. We subtract what's being supplied by the pasture and we get the 0.45. That's how much we need to provide with the hay. Same thing with the TDN. Our target is 5.85 pounds per day. We are getting 3.15 from the pasture, so that leaves us with needing 2.7 pounds per day. So we divide that among the 5 pounds of hay that we're going to feed per animal per day, and we receive numbers that indicate that we need hay to be at least 9% crude protein and 54% TDN. So nothing, not a super crazy, high quality hay, but we need some decent hay nonetheless. So this can help you kind of figure out, if you have to buy hay, what you can get away with. For our third option, we'll look at a scenario where, let's say we don't have any pasture. We're not expecting them to really get any nutrition from their pasture. We're just going to be feeding them hay and grain. So in this case, we'll use something called a Pearson square method. So let's say we have a mixed grass hay that's 10% crude protein and 58% TDN. And we have a grain mix that's 17% crude protein and 75% TDN. And we want to know what proportion of each we need to feed in order to meet our animals' requirements. So we're just going to do this for protein because the process is the same for TDN or any other nutrient. But we'll put our target crude protein content in this box here. And then we'll put our hay crude protein content here. And then our grain crude protein content here at the bottom. And then what we'll do is we'll take the absolute value of the difference across. So 10 minus, 12.2 minus 10 is 2.2 parts grain. This just kind of hops over here like that. And then we'll do the same thing. We'll go across here. We'll do the absolute value of the difference between our desired nutrient content and the nutrient content of the feed that we're subtracting across with. And for our grain, it's 17 minus 12.2, and that's 4.8 parts hay. This number just kind of, hay just kind of hops across here. And then we add, together to get our total parts, which in this case is 7. And then we figure out by percentage, 4.8 divided by 7. We need roughly about 68% hay in the diet, which equates to about 6.86 pounds. Remember, we're estimating to feed about 10 pounds per head per day total. And then we get our grain. We expect it to be 2.2 divided by 7 parts, which is about 31% of the diet. So which that multiplies out and equates to about 3 pounds of grain per day. So that would be a very basic approach to balancing a diet when you have 2 different feeds available to you. So as I mentioned earlier, I really try to stay away from using, a diet, percent protein recommendation for different diets. But if you're just looking to quickly evaluate, very quickly, if you're just glancing at a diet or something to that effect to see if it's in the ballpark for what you need for your type of animal, this table kind of summarizes what different classes of animals generally require for TDN as well as crude protein. So in our example, we had our growing animals. Our heifers were about 50% or more of mature weight. Their requirements were about 65% TDN as well, and 12% protein. So that aligns pretty well with our example earlier when we were looking at a diet that needed to be around 58% TDN and 12% crude protein. But again, these targets are going to vary depending on the type of animal, the type of feed and quality that you're feeding, as well as other management factors. So this is just for a very ballpark, very brief quick glance at your diets. I wouldn't use this as your Bible. So going along our different steps to building a balanced diet, we went through defining the animal, we went through listing our available feeds, and then we formulated our diet. Let's say that we fed our animal. The next step is to evaluate and adjust. I'm not skipping over feeding the animal just because nothing can go wrong there, because there are plenty of things that could go wrong there. But in the interest of time, I want to make sure that we get to one of the more important parts, or not more important, but one of the very important parts at the end, and that is to evaluate and adjust. So I always like to say, how do you know if you've done a really good job feeding your animals? And that the animals will tell you. And things to make sure that you're considering when you're trying to listen to your animals for them to tell you what you're doing well or what you're not doing well. Things to look at in terms of nutrition are things like body condition, performance, as well as animal health. So body condition, I'm going to spend some time on because that is probably one of the most important things to look at in the context of nutrition. And it's basically the evaluation of the amount of flesh or fat that an animal carries. And in beef cattle, it's on a scale of 1 to 9. The ideal condition of an animal varies a lot depending on its physiological state, but it's a really critical management tool for any system that involves breeding females, and we'll talk about that here shortly. And for a cow-calf operation, we generally recommend scoring cows 60 days before calving, at calving, and then again at breeding. At the very minimum. If you want to do it more frequently, that's great. Another one to throw in there that I like to suggest is at weaning time as well, because that can kind of give you a snapshot as to indicate, how your nutrition program is going, and if there are any, holes or different times during the animal's reproductive cycle that you should be, giving more feed or less feed or something like that. Underconditioned animals are animals that are undernourished. So like this animal here on the left, that would indicate that you'd need to increase nutrient density of the diet that the animal's eating. Overconditioned animals are going to be ones that are overnourished. So like this animal here on the right, and that would be an indication to you to reduce nutrient density of the diet. And if possible, we recommend that whoever's doing the body condition scoring be the same person that does it on a routine basis. Because it is a subjective measurement, we want to make sure that we're being consistent across different individuals. So what I might call a 5, someone else might call, a 5.5, but at least I am consistent with my scores. And that's the important thing, is the consistency. So again, just to reiterate why it's so important, especially in the context of reproduction. So if animals are too thin, so in beef cattle, if they're a score of 1 to 4, you're going to have issues related to reproductive reproductive function and fertility. So you might have females that fail to cycle, they might fail to conceive, and as a result of that, they will have an increased calving interval. You might have increased days to first heat or estrus after calving, and then you might also have decreased calf vigor because those cows won't be able to produce as much milk and or as good of quality colostrum after calving. If cows are too fat, so their scores of 8 or 9, they're going to be costly to maintain. They might have issues with dystocia or calving difficulty because it does interfere with some of the muscle contractions required for calving. You might have impaired mobility of the females. You may also have issues related to cycling and conceiving as well when animals are too fat. So this is just a snapshot of what some of these scores will look like. Obviously, this is a 1 here, and this is a 9 down here on the bottom right. For our breeding females, we generally want to stay around a 5 or a 6. Occasionally, we might see some dip down into a 4 or hop up to a 7, but we don't really want to see, on average, all of the animals being different from a 5 or a 6. And this is just another chart to kind of give you an idea of what to look for different body condition scores. So animals that are physically weak are obviously, and very thin, obviously, are going to have a score of 1. And that just gives you some different descriptors down here and what you might see at different types of body condition scores. So in terms of where to look when body condition scoring, there are a few different areas specific to beef cattle that we'll look at. We'll look in the brisket area, the ribs, the hooks, and the pins, as well as the tailhead, and then along the back. So those are the major areas that we'll like to look at when we are body condition scoring. And we just look for the amount of fat cover in those areas. As a general rule of thumb, if you're not really sure where to start, if it's really overwhelming, if the spinous process in the loin region, so that would be this loin region would be right in here. If it's easily distinguished, the score will generally be a 4 or lower. And then the other area that is helpful to start at too is that if in the last half of the rib cage with the long ribs here, if you can see 2 or more ribs, the score will generally be a 5 or lower. So those are some, I guess, some helpful tips if you're a little bit overwhelmed with the whole process. Some places to start would be those 2 regions. In terms of how to look, I mentioned that we are generally looking at the animals because it's not always practical to restrain our beef cattle, to, feel them and, actually touch and feel the amount of fat cover in these different regions. So it's acceptable to just look at them from a distance, but be mindful of hair coat thickness as well as rumen fill, because those things can make the animal look like they have more condition than they actually do. So this animal here, it'd be kind of challenging to look at the ribs because she has a lot of coat still on her from the wintertime. So again, tactile appraisal is better, but again, it's not always practical to restrain them unless you're already doing it for some other reason. Something else I like to look at in terms of evaluating the nutrition program is animal performance. So obviously for our growing animals, we can look at weight gain or average daily gain. Reproduction for our cows, we can look at pregnancy rate, pregnancy loss, as well as stillbirths. We could also look at, calving difficulty and things like that. And then we could also look at milk production. So that is generally going to be accomplished in the beef industry by looking at the offspring or the calf growth rates. We're generally not going to be measuring milk production in a beef animal as we would in a dairy animal. But I always like to remind folks that you can't evaluate what you don't measure. So if you're not keeping track of these things, it's hard to evaluate how you're doing. So if you're not keeping track, you should start so that you can kind of see, if there's something, an area that needs more attention or if things are going well. And then, of course, the last thing to look at in terms of evaluating your program is animal health and whether or not there's incidence of disease. Things that can be affected by nutrition include retained placenta or not passing the afterbirth within 24 hours of calving, dystocia or birthing difficulty. Grass tetany is a magnesium deficiency that can pop up during the springtime and other times when there's rapid forage growth. So you need to make sure that we're balancing and feeding mineral during times when that's a risk. Milk fever is a calcium deficiency that can also pop up if calcium is insufficient supply. Ketosis and mastitis are also issues that can come up as well if nutritional stress is upon the animal. So we've gone through all of our steps to building a balanced diet. We've just finished our last step of evaluating our diet by looking at the animal. So we're in good shape. And I just want to leave everybody with, the idea that the nutrition program is not a stagnant program and it should be monitored continuously to determine if you need to make adjustments. It's kind of a fluid situation because your animal, your animal description might change, your available feeds might change, and that affects what you're going to be formulating and feeding to your animals. So it's not a static program. It needs to change over time. So, and with that, I will wrap up. And if there are any questions, feel free to either unmute yourself or put them in the chat box.